Great. And we're recording. So good
Great.
evening, good afternoon, good morning, or wherever you are. Hello. And welcome to this short session on what is adaptive org design. And thanks for joining and coming in with your curiosity to know about this, and hopefully also even share some of the experiences of what you've seen happen and what's worked and what hasn't worked in your areas. And just to kind of get the ball rolling as well, I'm curious to hear from some of you, what were the conversations like in your respective breakout groups, and what are some questions that are coming up for you all? Or did we talk about things that were completely different to why we're connected here?
Yes, so I can go. In my group, we discussed about, like, one point we discussed about that what could be the limiting beliefs of the people which can hinder an organizational to be adaptive.
Mm,
So that was one point. And also there was point raised on that, how do we understand organization structures better, right? To give more democracy to people. I think that's also an important element. And we were also discussing about, like, rest, we are open to having insights from the session, but this seems to be very important because people, though we were in diverse roles, we wanted to understand, that how can we operate better with that kind of a growth mindset.
yeah. Lots of interesting questions. Yeah, great. Anybody else?
Just open curiosity, Dino, to what the session will bring.
Yeah.
This is not my area of expertise, so I'm in for anything.
No worries.
Well, also Brooke has an accent that's nearly Canadian, so I adopted her because I'm Canadian as well. So that's what else we learned.
Nearly Canadian. Does that mean you're in Minnesota or North Dakota or something?
No, I'm in the Northeast, but but quite close to the border.
Awesome. Welcome, Brooke.
Any other things that were discussed that has not been shared yet, perhaps, before we jump in?
Just the thought that from an agile perspective, many successful agile teams within an organization does not scale to organizational agility. Actually, Michael's saying that as they start to produce them, we actually bump into layers of management that are reluctant to let that grow. So it'll be interesting to see where this goes.
Yeah, great. So yeah, and so this is where we can kind of start talking about this concept of organization design, because there's this concept of agility and organizational agility, and also what does org design or organization design have to say with regards to organizational agility, and specifically with regards to organization design, what are elements of adaptive org design that we can kind of take into consideration when we want to have, let's say, increased agility or adaptability at an organization. And the idea is that when we're talking about organization design, one of the elements, it's not the only element, is the organizational structure. There are other elements that we also need to take into consideration in terms of culture, other policies, strategy, and all those kinds of things. And of course, there's a whole bunch of other topics that are involved, but just knowing that it's not just how we're going to put the names in the boxes and the lines and whose boss is who and all that kind of stuff. It's not just that. It's one element, but there are a whole bunch of other elements that we need to take into consideration when it comes to consciously designing an organization.
Mm. And as part of that conscious design is what are the structures that you can put in place in order to continue to support that adaptiveness that you're trying to optimize around. So for example, I'm just going to go ahead and say it. One of them is a certain level of agency. So if what you want is an organization to be adaptive, then one of the things that you have to design into the organization is, and I hate to say granting agency, it's more like enabling agency within the employees, that they actually feel like they have agency to make decisions, to take certain actions, to do certain things in response to outside stimulus in order to be adaptive, right? And that's one of the fundamental structures. And to Dino's point, I'm not talking about boxes and lines structure, right? I'm talking about, you know, a cultural structure, that supports and enables agency in your employees. Does that make sense so far?
Yeah, so we know that,
Okay.
for example, we want to consider things like, we all know that for adaptive or environments, or agile environments, or environments to allow agility to happen, that there is agency, there is autonomy, and a sense of accountability. We all know that. And the question is, as when we're looking at the design of an organization, is what kind of design would allow that? And also what kind of design would actually hinder that? And then to see what are the elements in a current organization's design that are actually helping things to get us closer to these goals, and what are some elements that are taking us further away, and considering how we want to start tweaking the org design to help us get us closer to enabling a better sense of agency, autonomy, and accountability. So I'm just curious, having heard of this, and I'm also aware that we're actually quite fortunate to have some people that are also quite in tune with the world of organization design. If there are any thoughts or comments or even disagreements, in fact, the idea is we want to have an open conversation here about this and get some other insights here. Any thoughts from anyone?
I just have to add one thing. What I have seen is that sometimes when the organizations are trying to achieve something, they actually put it in a very forceful manner. So basically, you're trying to co-create things, but it actually becomes a problem for the employees. Like I remember one specific thing where they were trying to impose Jira. Jira, as a platform which is for agility, right? So they were trying to impose Jira on people, and they created a leadership checklist to have a culture of that, whether the leaders are doing a good job or not. That actually became a headache for the leaders, right? So how do the organization assess themselves that what is the right appetite for people, or right pace in which they should be changing these structures or the design which they want to implement? I think participation is very important. It should not be something which should be coming top to down, but be involving employees as well.
Absolutely, and I think that actually speaks to agency again, right? That it sounds like somebody or somebodies somewhere in the organization felt the need to roll out Jira for there was a particular purpose. There's a particular need that they felt that they had, and they thought that rolling out Jira would help satisfy that need. However, in rolling it out, you're mandating that everybody use it, and then you start to ask yourself, if there's a mandate to use Jira, where's the agency that people have? Right? Where's their autonomy? Where's their sense of accountability? And it's really difficult for people to have a sense of accountability when they're told what to do, as opposed to creating the structures that enable them to choose what it is that they would like to do. People have a lot more sense of accountability when they choose their actions instead of being told.
Yeah, so then it's not just a matter of the structures that we want to put in place, but what are the policies that we want to put in place to help agency thrive in the organization? So it's not just simply saying we want to put this in place and off we go, roll it out, but doing it in a way that helps to create that sense of ownership within everybody in the organization, ideally. Any other thoughts or opinions with regards to this? Just curious to hear what others think.
Yeah, I think just to drill down a little bit on what you're saying concerning agency and its relationship to organizational design, I think it's useful to actually think a bit more about what do we actually mean by organizational design, because the agency that you're actually seeking to achieve may be based in both formal and informal structures within the institution, linked to delegated authorities and the decision-making powers. Now, somewhere may have on paper extremely, how should we say, extremely fluid and extremely flat hierarchies, which in principle might give the impression that there is the opportunity for a lot of agility, but in practice it might be quite the opposite.
Yeah.
Whereas you could have the alternative situation being that a structure that's highly hierarchical, but with clearly defined ways in which decisions can be taken and sort of authority is delegated so people know who they need to go to discuss. For example, introducing a new IT system, introducing a new tool, who needs to be involved in that discussion? If that's clear, and what's on paper is actually what happens in the institution, so, you know, the formal versus informal structure having prevalence, it might be a very agile situation, because you may be able to get a decision from the right people quickly and easily and not meet any of the potential blockages that may exist if you're in an informal context.
Yeah, and Jonathan, you couldn't have done a better segue into the next item that we were going to share, which is about consideration of the formal and informal networks that are in place. And the idea is that we want to have strong considerations in both. So the formal network being the things that are visible that you can put on paper, that this is the reporting structure that is in place, along with the informal networks. Who knows who influences who gets information to other people, and to kind of put that into consideration as well. And we need to be able to have effective considerations with the organizational design is to take into consideration both the formal and the informal networks that are in place. And just like you said, how the information does flow, and what we want to be able to do is to get to the point that we can make sure that the right information goes to the right people, so they can make the right or the most right decisions they can make at the right time. And if we can hit that every time, or at least as close as possible, then we're right as rain. And of course, it is a challenge, because we're not going to be able to get that right every single time, and that also is in flux.
Yes, for sure. And you know, I think though there you're hitting on two items insofar as the cultural feasibility within the institution and the desirability to the organization of the specific things you're trying to achieve, and where those two balance out against each other. But I'm curious as to what your thoughts are on, you know, what influence you believe or perceive is feasible between the informal and the formal structures. Because for me, at least, the experience is that normally they are the basis of the culture, and therefore you are limited by what pre-exists, is at least my perspective. But I'm curious to see what you think of that.
Yeah, so obviously there are elements that do pre-exist because of pre-existing, like you said, structures and things like that. And the idea is that if we want to see some change, sometimes some more drastic measures need to be taken place. I'm saying drastic because, you know, if we're talking about people that have been working, let's say, against each other for many, many years, and now all of a sudden need to be put in the same team, that is also quite drastic, and it's quite a tenuous situation for a lot of people. And therein lies also the possibility for changes in behavior but to be clear that it's not just enough just to put them in the same team and just assume that everything will be fine. I mean, I think we've all experienced quite a few situations where it's quite difficult. And what we do see is that if we give them the space to be able to share their thoughts and ideas, and for people to understand what it's like for the other person, and not to be able to get to the point that, okay, we need to make sure we're in agreement, but to at least get to the point that they're in alignment, that, okay, I don't fully agree with Mike, but I'm getting where he's coming from.
Mm-hmm.
And that is enough for us to be able to kind of work towards a common goal, even though we might have a different way of tackling the situation. I might be the designer, he might be the implementer of whatever it is that we're building. And we each have our own particular way of getting the job done. And we also understand that we need each other to get the job done completely. So it's not just I'm in the design department and he's in the implementation department. And that's also something that does take time as well. And it's also possible to find ways to work on this together. And what we find is that if people have some kind of capacity or capability to be willing to listen to each other, that would take them quite far.
I like I like Nidhi's comment here about diversity is important. And I 100% agree with you. And when we think about traditional org structures, at least a formal network of the structure, we tend to find lack of diversity, right? We have a department of implementers. We have a department of designers. We have the department of operations, right? Because we believe, or there is a belief, that by putting all the people who do the same job together, you're going to, maximize some efficiencies. You're going to be able to share best practices and all this other sort of, stuff that we think about. And what we have seen and find time and time and time again is that siloing of specialties may very well support a well-defined status quo, but it doesn't do very well in supporting adaptivity. It doesn't do very well in supporting the need to quickly shift and adjust and change based upon rapidly changing customer needs and market environments. And those kind of structures of specialty silos will actually actively work against your desire or your perceived need to respond to your marketplace. And so this is where diversity, well, one of the first things we hear about in an agile team is make it a cross-functional team, right? Grab a couple developers, grab a couple QA, grab a couple BAs, put them all together into this cross-functional team. And there's value in that because we recognize the value of that diversity. We recognize the value of pulling people from different specialties together into a single team. And so you take that as a small microcosm and start to expand it out. You have, Bob's point around cultural diversity, right? You have Jasmine's point around diversity of thought, diversity of lived experiences, all these different forms of diversity that we recognize if we can leverage them, then they can actually become a really big superpower in the adaptivity of our organization. So then the question becomes, yet again, that we've already asked 1,000 times, how do we fundamentally structure an organization in order to not just support diversity, but to actually encourage it and make it thrive and become a central theme within the organization?
And coming back to your point, Jonathan, is how do we also put it in such a way that people are encouraged by that? This is something that they want to be involved in, that it's not something that it feels forced on them. So it just feels like, we've been doing quite a bit of talking. Just curious, what are people's thoughts? I'm seeing, at least with the few people that I have their cameras on, some nodding. Just curious, what are other thoughts or questions that might be popping up? Or maybe even disagreements. We're not saying that we're right all the time. No one is.
I am. You may not be Dino, but I am.
I think part of it for me is always the question of how prepared or how comfortable or how are organizations leaning into experimentation?
Mhm.
Because that often becomes the barrier in the work that I'm doing with leaders and teams is, yes, we want all this, right? Like, yes, can we just check it off? Is there an easy way? What's the express lane to, I don't know, greatness and organizational adaptiveness? But it all comes down to their willingness to experiment. Otherwise, it ends up being a bit of a fad diet. So I don't know what your thoughts are on that, or what you've tried, or what you've moved along successfully. But that's what I find is key, is this experimentation willingness, let's call it.
So isn't that experimentation willingness a byproduct of psychological safety? And if the leaders or whoever you're working with don't feel safe in the environment, they feel like they have to deliver, they have to produce, they have to add value, that maybe the building block is starting there, this idea of agency and empowering people to make decisions. If they don't feel safe in that environment, then it doesn't matter what the structure looks like. Ultimately, they're not going to experiment. They're not going to try to do things that will take them outside their comfort zone.
Yeah.
Because they're worried about repercussions.
Yeah, absolutely. Because
That's a good point.
Yeah. Go ahead, Jasmine.
I think, so to Bob's point, I think that's super important, and that's a really important contributor. What I just thought of, and thanks Bob for this, what I just thought of also was, this is about organizational growth mindset as well. Like, you have to have all these other things, psychological safety, diversity. You have to have all these other things. If you are tending towards, we're probably right, then you're cooked, even if you have psychological safety and even if you have diversity, versus, hey, what don't we know?
Yeah, absolutely. And I give a concrete example of that. I was with a client recently where the organization was trying to make movement towards agility and adaptiveness, and they had the CEO buy-in, and he's like, this is something that we want. This is what we need to remain relevant for the next few years and stuff like that. And people are saying, I want to take risks, but I can't. And what happened was that even though we're trying to looking at how to change the organizational structure, they were still having all the policies, for example, performance management policies, where people were being rewarded for not taking risks. So if people are being rewarded for not taking risks, how much of an experimental mindset do we believe that we can foster with that in place? So this is how we can see that it can get pretty complicated pretty quickly. That is not, like we just said at the beginning, like we said at the beginning, it's not just simply changing the structure, putting people together that might not be willing to be put together at the beginning. And there's a whole bunch of different variables that also need to be taken into account. And these are the kinds of things we need to be mindful of when we want to look at helping an organization become more adaptive. So typically, I would also say that it's not just looking at the organizational structure, it's also about looking at the policies that are being put forth by HR. For like it or not, these people are humongous enablers or deterrents of any kind of transition to becoming more adaptive. So become friends with them is my suggestion. Yeah, so Jaylene also found that active change management and visible sponsorship is key on going to mitigate the fad diet outcome. Yeah, absolutely.
Absolutely.
And-
Hi everyone, Andrea Robb. I've worked inside for most of my career in HR, and I'd say one of the most, I wrote it in the chat here, one of the most detrimental things to innovation and experimentation, and this is a watch out for leaders, is the stories they tell either publicly or privately to one another about how someone or a team performed. I've heard a lot of like well-intentioned leaders who kind of fall back to, they get in the comfort zone of a talent review and they're like, well, you know, that thing didn't work. And it becomes like a cloud over the person or the team versus the story being told of here's what they learned. And I think that's leadership behavior, sort of being able to see it and call it out. And that probably is the single biggest impediment to a failure mindset. I'm sorry, my dog is like going crazy over here. So apologies for the background noise.
No worries, and thanks for sharing.
That's such a great point, Andrea. And you sent the chat just to me because we know each other. So the other thing I just thought of is I worked with an organization and they were talking about how the CEOs and senior leaders were talking about their failures. So this was an initiative to help this discussion precisely, except some of the senior leaders were talking about their failure when they were 26, once when they did this thing and it didn't work, not last week, you know, or last year, when we moved this massive change initiative forward and we, you know, imposed it, blessed the organization with it, and then it bounced off of us. So I think that's a great point. It's all like a lot of this is in the stories that you tell, because that backfired. You know, it was a great idea, great initiative. And then we're talking about when I was 26. Come on, like you failed last week. So let's hear about it.
That's
And-
really wonderful. Sorry, go ahead, Dino.
No, go ahead, Mike.
Well, I was going to say that I really love that you both are bringing up storytelling and leadership, because that's actually a very key component in leadership. So spoiler alert, Dino and I also have a leadership class in addition to an adaptive org class. And one of the key components in the leadership class is, you know, in growing to be a good leader, is the art of storytelling, right? And the purpose behind that is to attempt to inspire the people around you, right? It's to inspire a vision, right? So storytelling is a key component to leadership. And what I feel like a lot of leaders don't understand, or they fall back on, which is what you guys are talking about, is that they feel like an inspiring story or to inspire a vision always has to be on the positive. And I think they completely negate or don't realize how inspiring telling a story of failure can actually be to their charges and to the other people in the organization, right? Because it humanizes them to the rest of the organization. They aren't trying to say, hey, I have this great compelling vision and it's, you know, roses and unicorns, please come and follow me, right? It's, I have this vision and this worked, but this totally bombed on me, right? And these are the things that I learned, and I'd like to have you come and follow me because I've been through failure and I recognize that it's a critical step in the process. So I want to enable you guys to fail as well in order to help us reach this amazing vision.
Yeah, so it's not just when leaders and how they are when everything is fine. It's the most interesting is when things are not fine. You know, I'd rather hear a story about when things are going to be bumpy up ahead and how the leaders show up in those situations. And that's what will actually be a true indicator of how an organization might feel about its aspect of psychological safety, willingness to experiment, and to take risks. You know, if the leader says, hey, I mean, I think we all have heard enough stories about how leaders have been effective in the onset of the global pandemic, saying, hey, I have no idea what's going to happen either, you know, and we're in this together. When the going gets tough, yeah, exactly. I have no idea what's going to happen. It's going to be bumpy. We're going to be struggling, and we're in this together. And then people kind of say, okay, it's going to suck, but at least we know that it's that we know that we can expect that, rather than being told, oh, everything will be fine, don't worry, and we're going to let go of 2,000 people.
I just want to add 2 points here. One, if you take example of the CEO of Yahoo, who was Marissa Mayer. Basically, she joined from Google. And what I've seen is that many of these leaders, they have this, when they join a new organization, they have an urge to be able to deliver immediately. Because of that, they don't actually study the system. Whatever worked in the last organization, they would like to work here also, right? And it becomes a challenge because the organization was in a different culture, mindset, they have a different history. And I think this also led to her failure, because Google and Yahoo probably had a very different way of operating, right? So that's one thing which I think, I've seen many leaders, they don't want to adapt. They just want to, this is my experience, I'm going to bring it to you, and you have to apply the same to your company also. That's one thing. Second thing is also the balance between strategic design and operational design. Because, on the strategy part, there are a lot of good rosy things, but operationally it may not fit or support. Like if I take example of Google, a very good thing which I found in Google when I was working there was that they would allocate time to every kind of work that you're doing. So innovation project, you're giving 30% time. Trainings, you're spending 20% time. Personal growth or engagement, you're 10% time. So some examples like that. So they were keeping details of that kind of a structure, which allowed the employee to have that space to be able to experiment. Otherwise, what happens is, even if the employee wants to contribute, he may not get support from the manager because the structures are not supportive enough. So I think the balance is also very important, and most of the leaders miss on the operational bit, and they just think from a strategic level.
Yeah, and that's also one of the key aspects with being able to have an adaptive org design, or just an org design in general. It's not just looking at how you want to structure the organization, it's how you want to put everything together in terms of structure, policies, to best meet the strategy and the time. And the idea is of being adaptive is knowing that your strategy is going to be adaptive, that you also need to be able to adapt the organization, or the organizations have to adapt itself accordingly to best meet the strategic and operational goals in any given moment. And ways of doing that is this notion of being able to decouple the people from the work, because typically in very traditional organizations, it's you are the task, for example, or you are assigned the task, or the task is assigned to you, versus the concept of having an idea of this is the work that needs to go through, this is the value stream or the chain of value to get to the customer, and how people can organize themselves around these value streams to get the job done. It's going to be it's a slightly different conversation that takes place because of that. And the idea is that that certain value streams might increase or decrease in value, which also makes it a lot easier to say, okay, this is something that is getting a lot of traction. We need to invest more in this area, or this is a part that is not really having many merit anymore. Maybe we need to now organize ourselves around something else. And it's not to say that this has been a failed product. This is a product to be celebrated, and it's had its time.
At its time.
It's like when Apple transitioned from the iPod to the iPhone. It wasn't that the iPod failed. It was just that there was this new awesome thing that came across. And so this is one thing that a lot of organizations, even to this day, still struggle with, is having this notion of being able to decouple and then managing the work rather than managing the people, because the people can manage themselves because they're adults typically, right? As long as we treat them as adults.
Well, yeah, that's the key. And that's where the true self-organizing, self-managing teams comes into play. Because if you have the value stream and you're managing the work, right, through the value stream, but you're not necessarily managing the people, then the people can come together dynamically to say, hey, let's all come together and work on this part of the value stream, and or let's disintegrate or reintegrate in different combinations and permutations, right? In order to work on different parts of the value stream, in order to work on different parts of the product, based upon the ongoing and shifting needs. And when people have the autonomy and the capability to dynamically change the association of what they consider themselves as a team, or what part of the work that they are working upon, then you actually hit that, you know, Shangri-La of true self-managing and self-organizing teams.
Yeah. And just touching on a point that you just shared, Nidhi, in the chat about technical teams that are in the mindset that they have to deliver technical solutions. And that's also a challenge that we all face in many different organizations. And this notion of being an adaptive organization isn't about the solutions per se, but solving customer problems and having the customer at the center, which alludes to one of the 3 laws of agility that was coined by Steve Denning in his book Age of Agile, which are basically what he coined as the 3 fundamental laws, which is the law of the small team, the law of the customer, and the law of the network. And so the idea is putting them together. You have basically an organization that gravitates around the customer rather than expecting the customers to gravitate around the organization, and that you have small teams that are interconnected and communicating with each other to deliver value for the customer. That is fundamentally what organizations are trying to achieve with regards to being adaptable. And it could be that the customer has different problems on any given day. And the idea is about understanding what are these problems and what can be done by the organization to help solve these problems and deliver value to these customers.
Right. And good point, Nidhi, about using design thinking principles to look at problems in a new and different way. I think those are some really good structures, right? When we're talking about org design, right? Those are some good design structures to have in place. Design thinking, systems thinking. Oh shoot, I'm blanking, Dino. It's the it's the thing where people can liberating structures. That's it. You know, supporting liberating structures that will then support dynamic teaming or reteaming, or even just, you know, different structures within an existing team, right? You know, all these are different structural designs to help you become as adaptive as possible within your organization.
And that's something I just want to underline with what you just said there, Mike, because a lot of people think, maybe coming out of this call, but I can't change the organization design. Who am I? And, you know, does that mean I should give up? Well, not exactly. The idea is you want to look at how you can start to change the way people interact, because fundamentally what an organization design does is it shapes how people interact with each other. If you're putting everybody with one specialty in one area, and then you got other people in another specialty in another area, then you give them competing objectives, guess what's going to happen? You're going to have a recipe for some very interesting conflicts. Now, if you look at, maybe you can't change the way that everybody interacts because you can't change the silo structure and everything like that, you can at least maybe look at how you can get them to interact in different ways. And it might not make an immediate impact from one day to the next, but it might shape the way that people might be interacting over the coming weeks or months. Going from maybe that they didn't, or they weren't willing to communicate on day one, and now they're at least willing to listen to each other. Okay, it's like a gradual thing, but if you're able to, you know, people say that the definition of insanity is doing the same thing and expecting different results. That if you're going to have the same meetings or the same interactions, of course you're going to get the same results. So the question is, how do you shape or how do you impact the way that they communicate in a way that can help them to interact in a different way, or perhaps in a more productive or a positive way?
Or even just in a more adaptive way.
Yeah.
I have a quick question. For those of us who talk this language and think this stuff all day, and you're talking to somebody who's curious about this, knows what they're doing isn't working. It may be an, emergent leader or a CEO who's open, is starting to realize the way we've been working isn't working. How do you break it down in a tangible way? 'Cause I find as an OD consultant, I often am asked, like, what's the output? We're going to have an artifact at the end of this. And I'm curious how you make tangible or clear without using any of the language we understand, adaptive, liberating structures, systems thinking, design thinking. I use those every day, but not everyone uses those every day.
Yeah,
How do we break this down?
Yeah. So, Mike, you can chime in with your thoughts. My thoughts are I try to use as much as possible the language that they speak in, because I typically find that if what they want isn't a change in their org design, what they want isn't agile, what they want isn't to be more adaptive. What they want is some form of business impact, I imagine. If not, then we try to figure out what that is, because otherwise we're going to be struggling with trying to getting people aligned on this, because and so it could be that they want to be more competitive in growing markets, or they want to reduce their time to market in their key portfolio items in their strategic portfolio, or it could be just simply something like increased retention, or better employee satisfaction, or better customer satisfaction, or increased market share. A whole bunch of different things. I'm not here to tell them this is what you want, but asking what they want, and then looking at, okay, what are the things that we can kind of put in place based on things that are coming from the agile world, from the org design world, from other ways that people can interact, or even just basic coaching that can help bring those results to life. And then building confidence, and then it says, yes, I want that. Then kind of peel it back and start bringing in some of the buzzwords that we might be more familiar with. Because I typically find that if people are saying, I want an agile transformation, why do you want that? To be more agile. And say, okay, this is going to suck for a lot of people, because there isn't a huge lack of clarity there.
No compelling
People
vision.
are always going to be asking years afterwards, why are we even doing this? Why are we struggling with this? Why are we going through so much pain to get this thing done when we don't even know why we're doing it?
Yeah, makes sense. And one last follow on. Do you typically use any visuals, or, are you whiteboarding with people? Are you visualizing it? Do you have artifacts of your own to say, like, I often just find to try to help them see, like, well, teams might, be circles versus squares, and they're adjacent versus all lined up on, just sort of getting people out of the org chart mentality. How do you do that visually?
Yeah.
Great segue. Should I bring up the hold on, give me a second.
So while Mike is trying to figure his technology snafus, what we can say is that because I know that there are also challenges, because they say, look, it's great that we're going to change the way things are, but we still need to make it fit the tool, which is always fun. But the idea is that we change it in such a way that it basically makes it very difficult to fit the tool. Like, we can say, okay, we change the hierarchy to circles, but it's still a hierarchy, and things like that. So what we want to do is really break these schemas to where they say that this can't fit the old paradigm. And so some examples are, for example, like we were mentioning before, the physical decoupling of the people from the work, or actually saying that, it's not the CEO at the top, and then you got the C board and the directors and the VPs and all that kind of stuff trickling down, but to also say, these people report to this person and this person reports to these people. You know, like one typical thing coming from the sociocratic world is the idea of double linking. Why not? But again, it's also about, you know, what is the problem we're trying to solve with this? Not just painting it, but actually that we structure the organization as a network.
Dino, just to add to your point, one point of visualization is also where I've seen like a lot of companies, especially startups, they've started having cool designations. So they are not like AVP, VP, or functional manager. You know, they are specifically designed role titles which are just relating and talking about your work and not about the power or the position that you have. And I feel that this actually, basically facilitates a lot of more effective conversations, because even if you're talking to a person who is like 15 years more experienced than you, he does not have a very powerful title which makes you scared in the organization. Yeah. So I've seen it working quite a number of times, and I think that's one way to look at it.
Great. Yeah, that's a great example. I was in a startup once and they say, what do you want to be called? What role do you want to have? And call it like
fun officer,
design ninja or something like that. And yeah, this person's a design ninja. Okay, cool. Things like that.
So so just to answer you, Andrea, you were asking about like visualizations, right? Images and different things like that. So when Dino and I are talking about, you know, adaptive org design, this is kind of like a very high level image that we have. You start in the middle, you put the customer in the center, you have teams that revolve around the customer. We've already talked about agency, autonomy, and accountability. That all requires trust. It we require teams to take ownership, right? But for teams to take ownerships, then managers need to get out of the way. But in order for managers to get out of the way, teams need to take ownership. So it's very much a double loop there, which all requires trust and accountability kind of at the basis. And we want to move from trees to networks. And these are the value streams around the customer. Each one of these is a value stream that is focused on a particular customer need. And all of these value streams are then supported by the overall corporate strategy. And this is just, you know, the usual identify, exploit, subordinate, elevate, and repeat the theory of constraints when you're trying to find areas for optimization. So we find that this is a good like high level. And then of course, we can dive in and talk for 2 to 3 hours on any one of these single images.
So the idea is that it might seem a bit simplistic, but the idea is that we want to opt for principles, and rather than saying, okay, these are the rules or these are the steps to move these in place. Of course, we're not going to be able to get a large organization to have now half a dozen or a dozen value streams, and you got some supporting teams and then the strategy, and away we go. Of course, there's a whole more complexity to that. Sure. The idea is how can we move in that kind of direction to at least make things simpler than what they were before, and ultimately it's not how do we design the end state, but how do we design for it a way for it to be able to keep adapting and to keep evolving.
Yeah,
that's the key.
I think that is also a little bit more palatable, particularly for people from different areas such as HR or senior leadership, where they might say, I don't like the idea of, you know, pulling the rug from underneath from everyone, and we don't know, and we're trying to figure out who from what. And the idea is that let's take a small incremental approach and find out along the way, and dealing with all the resistance that comes from that as well. So yeah.
So just one last question on this topic is basically that in the times of COVID, when there will be more work from home teams, right, and more remote opportunities, how do you think that organization will have to like really radically think of a redesigning in these times?
Good question. I'm curious to hear what others think about this as well.
And I also want to just acknowledge that we are at the top of the hour. So if you need to go, we understand and appreciate your time. But yeah, I'd like to hear if anybody has a response to Nidhi's question.
I missed the question. Because do you want to repeat it?
So the notion of with everybody working remotely these days, if this is going to be something that's going to impact the way organizations are designed in the future. Did I catch you there correctly, Nidhi?
That's correct.
Yep.
I don't think there's a way to avoid it. And in fact, I think it'll be an impetus to smart organizations will figure out that the new structures of where we work could actually instigate change around how we work. I think what I'm seeing, 80% of the companies versus the 20 who are innovative around this are just hustling to get policies together to figure out how to work in different states. And like in the US, it's like it becomes a really big, like a tax puzzle. Like are we operating now in 50 states, and how do we report employees, and how do we make sure our technology works and set them up? And those are all really important things to get right. But what I'm noticing is HR so short-term in their thinking right now that they're unable to step back and say, now, how are we going to work differently, better? How could this increase diversity? How could this improve our talent pipeline, which I think is another, silver lining, that you can find talent anywhere if you think about them being available to you anywhere. Or how do teams come together in meaningful ways? So I think there's tons to be done, but I'm guessing more than not are going to just try to work out the kinks of remote working, and which is a miss.
Absolutely. I'm also getting the sense that some areas are now starting to have conversations about, well, now we don't have as many physical constraints. Typically, we would see that departments are also constrained by the number of desks they can put in the floor. Now, if that is taken away, what could an organization look like if that's no longer a constraint? So that's also some very fascinating conversations that could be coming up over the next couple of years.
Absolutely. So so thank you all for you all for sticking around for an extra few minutes. I do appreciate the extra time that you're giving Dino and I. I just want to take a minute to say that to let you know, in the file that I uploaded, we're also going to put it into the LinkedIn event, so you can go and check it out there if you can't get it off of Zoom. Is that the handout? The handout kind of like talks about some of the high-level topics that we talked about today, but it also references a class. So this particular session is what is adaptive org design, and there is a class that Dino and I are offering on adaptive org design, where it's not just a what is it, but how do we do it? How do we deep dive into each one of those images that I just showed you? How do we set an organization up along their adaptive journey in order to become more adaptive, and a whole bunch of other stuff in between there. So if you take a look at that file, and you'll get some more information about the class. There's an email address. You can reach out to Dino and I on LinkedIn and ping us there as well. If you have any questions whatsoever, we'll be obviously very happy to answer them. But in the meantime, we will do this again May 11th, I think, Dino, is our next one. Yeah, and
2 weeks.
So I feel like a YouTube star, where I'm just like and subscribe to our leadership space on LinkedIn. You will get notifications for the May 11th event, as well as get notifications about the class itself happening on June 1st. But yeah, I just wanted to take a minute to say that, and thank you again for your time today. Thank you again for sticking around an extra 6 minutes past the top of the hour. Dino and I will stick around if you have any more questions or thoughts, you want to continue the conversation, we're here. But I also want to recognize that if you need to go, we are 6 minutes past the hour. So thank you. Thank you everyone for joining.
Thanks very much, everyone. Thanks for joining.
It's great. Good to meet you.
Nice to meet you too, Andrea.
Bye.
Thank you so much.
Seems like I missed all the fun.
Did you join just at the very end, or did you join
Well,
and then pop in and out?
I came in early on,